Hello, everyone. I just wanted to do a supplementary video on the Unit 1 readings. If we look at Unit 1, we are reading Epicurus's letter, Thomas Nagel's death, and Bruckner and Fisher's Why is Death Bad? I don't want to get into too many of the details of these readings. That's what I do in the other videos, but to try to give you a more holistic sense of what's going on in Unit 1. Unit 1 is the foundation of Unit 1 is really kind of the foundation of the course, and that is Epicurus's letter. Epicurus, in a few lines, gives us one of the most substantive theories about death, commentaries on death in the whole of Western philosophy. And it has certain implications which philosophers have never really liked. Epicurus's basic idea is that since death is the end of all awareness, that it is the end of all consciousness, end of all experience, that it's not something that can be good or bad for us. One of the key things that he says is that in order for something to be good or bad for us, that is to have some sort of value for us, it must be something that we experience. It must be something to us before it can be good or bad. And since it's nothing to us, it can't be good or bad. And although I think that this is a perfectly logical conclusion from his starting point about death, it is not something that philosophers have really liked. Because, as Thomas Nagel says, our common sense view of death is that it's a bad thing. And here we're talking about bad thing for the person who dies. Unit 1 is not about grief. Unit 1 is not about the way that the living respond to the deaths of others. Unit 1 is about how we regard our own deaths, really, primarily. And the question that emerges in Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher about the badness of death is exclusively about the badness of death regarding, or as it relates to the person who dies, not to anyone else. Okay, that should be clear. But Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher want to hold on to our common sense notion that death is the worst thing that can happen to someone, whereas Epicurus clearly rules that out. And that for him, that makes no sense, because death is really not something that happens to you, because at death you become nothing. So there's really nobody there for it to happen to, I suppose, is the idea. Really, that's what the focus is of the second two readings. That is, Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher are responding to this implication of the Epicurean view of death, that it can't be considered a bad, an evil, a misfortune, however you want to put it, for the person who dies. Nagel's the way that Nagel attacks it is to basically come up with a different way of regarding what it means for a bad thing to happen to someone. And the key in Nagel, I believe, is his assertion that someone doesn't have to be aware of a bad thing in order for it to be a bad thing for them. That is, that if we think of his key hypothetical regarding the person who's experienced the brain injury that has reduced them to the state of a contented infant, what he's trying to get at through that is to say that, well, we would say that a bad thing had happened to such a person, even though they were not experiencing anything negative. That we would certainly still think that something bad had happened to them, even though they were not aware of the bad, and even though they were not suffering because of the bad. Whether he's right or wrong about that, it's a strong response to Epicurus. Well, what would you say about this? So what he's trying to do is refute this idea, obviously, that death can never be considered to be a bad thing for the person who dies. Whereas Bruckner and Fisher are focusing on the so-called asymmetry problem, and that's something you really need to understand, what they mean by the asymmetry problem. It is dealt with in a cursory way by Nagel, but in a much more detailed way by Bruckner and Fisher, the idea that we treat our prenatal non-existence and our posthumous non-existence asymmetrically. And that from the Epicurean point of view, that is illogical, that is irrational, because they're both just periods of non-existence. So what Bruckner and Fisher really need to do, and their focus on the asymmetry problem is their way of answering the question why death is bad, why the period of non-existence after death can be considered worse than the period of non-existence before death. And that has to do, obviously, get into the videos about how we regard future bads and the future pains and pleasures as opposed to the way that we regard past pains and pleasures. Ultimately, their answer to the question why death is bad focuses on pleasures rather than pains because of certain details in there. But I just wanted to give you, some sense of, why I put these things together, that really Epicurus offers us this general theory of death. One of the interesting implications of which is that death cannot be considered to be a bad thing for the person who dies. And really the second two readings in the unit can be thought of in different ways as attempts to refute that implication, not to refute the general Epicurean idea that we become nothing at death. Nagel and Bruckner and Fisher are neutral on that. They say, well, that could or could not be true, but that's not what they're attacking. They're basically accepting the idea that we do become nothing at death, that death is the end of all consciousness, all sensation, all experience. They're accepting that, at least for the purposes of the argument, but explicitly attempting to refute that one of the implications of that is necessarily that death cannot be considered a bad thing for the person who dies. Each of the second readings attempts to prove that that's not true, that despite us becoming nothing at death, that our deaths are still misfortunes or evils or bad things for us.